Shalom and welcome to another edition of Parsha Talk. I'm Rabbi Elliot Malman in Highland Park at the Highland Park Conservative Temple Congregation on Shemet. Joining me, my good friends, Rabbi Barry Chesler in Long Island, Solomon Schechter, Anshe Chesed, Jeremy Kalmanovsky, Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanovsky, getting it all backwards today. We have Toldot, Parasha Toldot, which, as you know already, is an amazing Parsha because it takes us into the next story. We're in the next generation. Isaac, Ele, Toldot, Yitzchak ben Avraham, Avraham olidet Yitzchak. And if we had a lot of time, we'd talk about that first pasuk, but we are going to just say something that this Parsha, different from last week's Parsha. Last week, it's a novella. It's marriage. It's romance. This week, we're right into it. It's tough. The opening scene, and I'll get Barry and Jeremy to comment on this. We have Yitzchak ben Arba'im Shana, he's 40 years old when he marries, and then it gets really hard. This is difficult. She is not able to have children. Vaye'atar Yitzchak l'Adonai lenochach Ishto. He entreats God on behalf of his wife, ki akarahi, because she may not conceive. Vaye'ater lo Adonai v'atar Rivka Ishto. So Jeremy, pick it up from there. What's going to happen in that moment or in the moments afterwards, and maybe take us into this relationship too and what's going on.
Well, I don't know about the relationship exactly, but this is a wonderful pattern, another example of our biblical matriarchs. The long desire for a beloved child, it delayed terribly, long by infertility. Sarah was infertile for 10 years in the land, obviously a long time before that, but 10 years in the land. Rivka, now 20 years, it's been 20 years. She's really had this tremendous trouble, but God accedes to Yitzhak's prayer. She becomes pregnant. Presumably Yitzhak does his part too. And then she's having a terribly difficult pregnancy, and the twins are struggling within her womb. The symbol of Jacob and Esau being these two brothers, not just that they're biologically connected, but they represent two different sorts of archetypes. Esau as a person of the field, he's wild, he's extremely physical. Yaakov ish tam yoshev ohalim, he's a gentle person, he dwells in tents. The whole history of Jewish masculinity is written in these verses, that this sort of fear of, desire to be, the comparison with Esau with all of his physical mightiness and the intellectual or gentle or spiritual quality of Yaakov. But it's not just that the two fetuses are struggling within her. It seems like the two sorts of ways of being are struggling within her. And she says, Im kain lama ze anochi? Why do I even live? This is what I wanted. This is what I prayed for. This is everything that I thought I should be as a woman in an ancient society. It's all about having children. This stinks. This is terrible. Why am I going on living?
It's hard not to feel that intensity, that pain for her. Vayitrotzetsu is the word that you used. Vayitrotzetsu. And I was looking at the Everett Fox translation. He says they're literally crushing up against each other. It's hard not to feel like the sandpaper, the crushing of the two embryos, the two fetuses inside her. And Barry, remind us that beautiful midrash of the boys inside the womb.
So the rabbis are perplexed by the word vayerotzesu, and one of the understandings is that it's from the roots to run. And every time Rebekah, who apparently lived in the ancient Israel a little bit different in my imagination than in the rabbis, every time she would pass a place of pagan worship, Esau would run to get out of the womb. And every time she passed a yeshiva, Yaakov Avinu would struggle to get out of the womb. And so we have within her womb an existential conflict, the conflict of existence. And what I think is important to keep in mind is that the prophecy or the oracle is quite clear. The younger shall serve the older. But well, it depends on how you read it, I guess, right?
It's not so clear then. Rav Yavot Sa'ir, which means the elder serves the younger, but it could also mean that Rav Yavot Sair, that the
Well,
younger will
the
serve the younger.
punctuation is Rav Yavot Zair, right?
It
I mean,
depends
that's
where you
what the Trop
punctuate.
says. Well, that's the Trop, right? So the later tradition, obviously. But what's interesting to me, though, is that despite the oracle, and I accept your criticism, it should be clear, right? That's why you go to an oracle, is for clarity, not for cloudiness. The situation in the womb is not yet set, because one would think that actually Jacob should be born first.
Interesting. So I want to go into this for a second. Describe a pregnancy. A woman in pregnancy starts to feel the movement, in a real sense at about 20 weeks or maybe before, and she gets this oracle around that time, midway through the pregnancy. She has to live for the balance of her pregnancy, which would be about another 16, 20 weeks, whatever. She's going to go 36 weeks, with the knowledge of what's going on inside her. I think that's an enormous burden in addition to the pregnancy, it's an enormous burden to have psychologically, that something is happening inside you and you have no control over it. Is that something to react to or something?
Well, the question is, how do we think she actually internalizes the oracle? Meaning she's told that there are two conflicting nations within her womb, and she does not yet know with which one she will identify.
Okay, which brings us, it's very interesting. So then we'll go right away to the Vayimlu Yameh Laledet, the term. She reaches the term, Vinei Tomim B'Vina. Yeah, the narrator tells us she has twins, duh. Vayetze Harishon Admoni. The first one comes out Admoni, which you have the root Adom, red, ruddy, kind of coarse. Kulo Ke'aderet Se'ar, like he's wearing a mantle of fur. Okay, Vayikru'u Shemo Esau. We'll talk about it in a second. So she sees the first one come out like deformed almost. It's scary. I don't know if she attended many births before, but presumably she thinks that she's going to be startled by this apparition. And so maybe at the immediate moment that she sees the child, the moment that she's going to be exultant, she's horrified. And maybe that's the oracle, that she's associating that with the oracle. And then, of course, a second later, in the next very moment, his brother came out. His hand was holding on to the ankle of Esau, Vayikra Shemo Yaakov, and he called his name Yaakov. Vayikra, presumably it's Yitzchak, and we learn that Yitzchak is 60 years old. So with the little facts that we have here, we have 20 years between the marriage of Isaac and Rebekah till the birth of the boys, which means that the barren, the period of her inability to conceive was 20 years, or their inability to have children was 20 years, a long time. That when, in fact, she is pregnant, it's a horrible pregnancy. She's exasperated. And when the birth happens, it's like, oh my God, this is overwhelming. And one little point here, which is, and we'll go to this with Esau. Esau is there's something that is not normal here. And immediately the text hints to that by saying, Vayikru'u Shemo Esau, they called him Esau. And the picture that I'm presenting here, and I'd like you to react to it, is that, so in the birthing chamber, I'm assuming that there's a midwife, I'm assuming that there's a nurse, I'm assuming that there may be a couple of other people. I don't know if Isaac's in there also, but there are people helping her as she's giving birth, and they see that the child is ruddy and kind of different, and they name him Esau, which is unusual, and his unusual nature, his unusual physical nature, contributes to the othering of him throughout his life.
So yeah, I want to draw your attention to two things. The first one is the curiosity of the verse. Vayetze Harishon Admoni, which will generate the name Edom. Kuoka Deret Seir, which will generate the name Seir. Vayikra'u Shemo Esau, which doesn't make any sense. So that's point number one. But if you pay attention to the next verse, his brother comes out next. Yado Chazet Ba'akev Esau, and he's holding the heel of Esau. Vayikra Shemo Yaakov suggests that Esau names him Yaakov, and this is picked up later in the story when Esau will tell Isaac that he has grabbed my heel twice. He has supplanted me twice. So it seems to me, at least, that one can make the inference that, in fact, Yaakov was the name that Esau gave his brother, not Isaac.
Or
Well, he's a
maybe,
little baby though, you know.
yeah, the little baby. No, maybe. Look,
I like the big maybe.
yeah, really. They grow up with these names somehow, and the names stick. The names, Kishmo Hukenu, basically, as is his name, so is he. And that there is a certain cruelty that happens when a person is named something, or a person gets a nickname, and the nickname is derogative and stays with the person throughout their entire life.
But even when it's just a childish nickname, it could stay with them their whole life.
So
right? It doesn't necessarily have to be derogatory.
Okay.
But what's interesting is if we go with my idea, which, let's face it, I always like to do, then, Yaakov is Esau's kid name for his brother. And then his real name is actually Yisrael, as the angel will anoint him in 2 weeks.
Well,
So
that's pretty important because there's there's a quality of the Bible which is really, it's so wonderfully intertextual, with multiple stories talking to each other, multiple passages talking to each other. And one thing that, if you study rabbinic commentary, they are so fabulously sensitive. If we're lucky, we sort of know the parts of the Bible that we read in synagogue, and much less the other ones. But in the book of Jeremiah, which is the Haftarah, I think, on Tisha B'Av, or one of the
Rosh Hashanah, right? Isn't the one about?
I'm lost at this real quick, but I think it's one of the summer morning days, whether it's 17th of Tammuz or Tisha B'Av or whatever. Ki kol ach akov Yaakov, v'kol rea Rachil Yaloch. Every brother, Akov Yaakov. Jeremiah says, Akov Halev ve'anushu mi'yida'enu. The heart is twisted, and the Akov is twisted. And then he goes on to say, Kikol ach Akov Yaakov. Every brother twists indeed his. So Jacob is a twister. He's a perverse kind of character. We love him. He is certainly, anyone who's reading the Bible knows that we are on the side of Jacob and not on the side of Esau. He's our guy. Esau is, as Elliot said, othered. But the Bible's own judgment about Yaakov is that he's a twisty, sneaky, he trips people up. He trips his brother up. And poor Esau, who, though Jewish tradition is like super hard on poor Esau, I think the Bible is actually quite sympathetic to him getting the runaround quite a bit. And that line, that every brother Yaakov's his other brother, it is a judgment about the victimization that's going to happen to Esau at Yaakov's hands.
All right, so let's talk about their characters. And in characteristic form, the Torah really compresses their whole young lives. Vayigdalu hane'arim, they grow up. Vayihi Esav ish yodei atzayid. Esav was a person who Yodei Atzayid, knew the hunt. Ish Sadeh, a man of the field. V'Yaakov Ish Tam Yoshev Olim. And Yaakov was Ish Tam, and we'll have to translate Tam. It may not be the Tam of the Haggadah, simple. It probably means something more like whole or wholehearted or plain or soft. Yoshev Ohalim, he dwells in tents. So I was, before we were recording, we talked about a theory that I have, which is that Esau, who is othered from birth, really, tries to cast his lineage, his understanding of himself, in the parallel line, not in the Abraham line that comes all the way from Shem, but in the line that comes from Ham. And the line that comes from Ham includes the only other figure in the Torah and in the Bible who is actually identified as a hunter, and that is Nimrod. Nimrod is a gibor, a strong man. He's a king. and he's a Gibor Tzayid. And so here is the boy who, having emerged ruddy, red, furry from his mother, and sees himself from the youngest of age, as all children do, is differentiated from everybody else, is ostracized is probably teased, and he has the legend of Nimrod somewhere circulating around him, and that's what he wants to be. He wants to grow up to be a Nimrod. And it almost is as if he develops this talent, and then people say what people say about Nimrod, which was a common statement about Nimrod, that, Nimrod is a great hero. Nimrod is the great strongman. It's almost like saying, right, you grow up and you have talent in hockey and you say, the little Gretzky. He's a little Gretzky. He grows up to be a Gretzky. And so I think that Esau was probably, inoculated with this idea that A, you're different, and B, you are trying to identify yourself with a heroic archetype, and then you become that.
And I don't know, I cannot imagine what ancient people thought about, human anthropology, right? Like, we happen to know that, like, ancient prehistorical humans were hunters. They were hunter-gatherers. And then we became agricultural people, and we settled in towns and then developed them into cities, and we developed the complex societies and economies that we have. It's almost, in the way that you just said, with which I agree, that Esau is portrayed here as like that kind of, and this is a modern term that of course the Bible would never use, but this is man in the state of nature, right? He's part of that world. He goes out and catches antelopes. He comes back with this yummy gazelle to eat. And Yaakov is a city boy. He's a city mouse. He doesn't know how to do any of that stuff. And Esau is portrayed as belonging in that outside world. And when Yitzhak smells him and says, my son smells like the fresh fields, you can just totally get the Jew, the urban Jew, who is afraid of and is jealous of that person who belongs in the fields.
It's such
So I want to take issue with one thing you said, Jeremy. I don't think that Yaakov here is portrayed as a city person. He's portrayed as a shepherd. Right? In the city, you don't live in a tent, you live in the house. And I think the fact that he's described as a tent dweller is important. And, when you were reading the verse, I was struck, Elliot, that Vayigdalu HaNa'arim, the youths grew up, Vayiyu Esav Ish Yodei Sa'id, and Esau came into his own as a man of the field, and Jacob came into his own as a man of the tents, meaning that they carved out their own identity, which I think complements what you were saying about Esau. It's also true of Yaakov, that Yaakov also may have been misunderstood as a youth and comes into his own as a Sishtam Ohalim. And and I think what's interesting to me is that there is no city here.
There's no city, and I think
no civilization.
They're both linking to different kinds of archetypes. They're different kinds of pasts. And Jeremy, I think the point of Esau reaching back to a primitive past. I mean, that culture is still with us, by the way. There's plenty of people that hunt, in the world, and plenty of people in this country, which is a highly civilized country, that do this recreationally. And I only urge the video, our listeners and viewers to kind of Google deer hunting on YouTube and react to that. I was doing that just to do a little research, and because I don't hunt and I don't fish, and I find it all fascinating and horrifying at the same time. And that's precisely the point, which is we do not come out of a culture that is hunting. Even back, in the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, there is no hunting there. What they do is they raise sheep, they kill sheep, they eat meat, but they certainly do not do that by hunting. And hunting harkens back to an ancient, a prehistoric past. Basically,
is a fair question to ask. But by the way, I've never hunted anything in my life, but of course have no interest in doing that. But I did have a good friend of mine in high school. One of my closest friends was he didn't count in the minyan, and he and his brothers, they were big hunters, and I very, very clearly remember the first Saturday in November, they would go off, the deer season would open, they would each get a deer, they would come back, the deers would drain on their porch, they would butcher them and eat them all winter, they would freeze them. And my friend Mark Krebs, who lives in California now, used to say, there's nothing wrong with this. I haven't done anything wrong. In fact, it's a lot more natural to go out into the deer's environment, kill the deer myself, than to have, we didn't use the term factory farming back then, but it's a lot more natural than buying something in the grocery store that's been wrapped in shrink wrap and factory farmed. And I do think that that's probably correct.
That is correct. We have a certain admiration for that. There are people, around Camp Ramah, by the way, what they will do is they'll shoot a deer or maybe two, and that will last them for the entire winter. They'll freeze it, and they'll do that. And of course, the preservation and refrigeration didn't exist, in those days the way it is. And so that brings us back to the story.
Just say real quick, just one thing about the Torah. This is just a small halachic detail. You have to shecht a deer or an antelope also.
Yes.
You can't kill it with a bow and arrow or a gun. So you have to trap it. And as a halachic detail, those things are kosher. Yes. You can have kosher deer, you can have kosher antelope. I think you can even have kosher giraffe, although God knows how you'd know where to slice it on the neck. But you have to, there's one important thing. First of all, you have to catch it. And the rabbinic literature does talk about sad tzvi. You trap the deer and then put it in the pen and then get to where you can shecht it. But the Torah, first of all, assumes that you can eat these things, because back in Deuteronomy, then when it talks about eating non-sacrificial meat, it says you can eat it katzvi v'cha'ayal, like the deer or the ram, which is evidently something that people must have known what the hell that meant. But the second thing is that a domesticated animal, a cow or sheep, you don't have to pour out the blood on the ground, or you do have to pour it out, but you don't have to cover it. The deer or the antelope or whatever, you pour the blood into the ground and cover it back up in this ritual, which I don't exactly know what it means, but I think it means something like, you have an extra obligation to sort of return this animal to the wild, something like that.
I'll tell you something, Highland Park, we have a lot of deer here. So when you talk about shechting them, it's actually quite a real issue here. I'm sure there are a lot of people here that would like to shecht the deer that are in this town, especially when they, chew up your tomatoes and your whatever in your backyard, as they do in mine. However, okay, which brings me to Esau coming in from the field. He is coming back on a day, I guess, of hunting, and it says Vayavo Esau min hasadeh, comes back from the field, v'hu ayef, and he's tired. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and say he wasn't particularly successful that day, or was he? Because he's famished. Ayef anochi, he's tired. He's full. Haliteni na min ha'adom ha'adom hazeh. He sees Jacob brewing up a lentil stew. He doesn't necessarily know at that point that it's lentil. He sees it's only red. He may think that it's a blood stew, and which is why the Torah really gets us to understand that he has this appetite for red things, which is blood. And of course, that's when Jacob manipulates him. Can you give me 2 seconds about that scene in your own mind, or just what stands out for you in that scene, just either beginning, during, or end of that? That's just it's a very powerful scene. Barry, go ahead.
It's a poignant story, and I think the word ayef conveys the poignancy in that it could be that he was not successful, but another way to read it is that he was too tired to eat the meat. In other words, the hunt itself had consumed all of his energy. So he comes back too tired to fix his own meal. And so he's relying on his brother, and he sees, as you suggest, perhaps something that is reminiscent of the hunt, the red stew, and he wants that instead.
Yeah. Okay.
I would say that I think the story is tremendously rich because, first of all, the Bible always picks a word often picks a word that is, you could have used any word for cook. Vayazed Yaakov Nazid. It sounds to any Hebrew reader like lehazid, mazid, to do something intentionally devious, sneaky, rebellious. So Jacob, just from the sound of the word, a Hebrew reader would say, Jacob's being sneaky. And Esau, but again, returning to that concept that I said before about and I accept Barry's amendment about he can't be portrayed as a city person because it's an anachronistic story of shepherds. That's correct. But I do think that the story of masculinities, of macho man and gentleman, is definitely at work here. And yes, Jacob is portrayed, in my opinion, as sneaky, nasty, not entirely nice. Kol ach Yaakov Yaakov, but Esau is portrayed as a big doofus because he's so hungry. He thinks, if I don't get lunch right now, I'm going to die. So what do I care about an inheritance? This is about my satisfaction right this second, right this minute. I don't have any time to wait. And Jacob says, okay, then just trade me, your inheritance rights. And he says, that's fine. And so Jacob gives him the food. So he eats and he drinks and he gets up and he leaves. Thus, vayivez Esav. Then he scorns the birthright. This guy, in point of fact, Esau is not the guy to be Abraham's heir. Okay, Jacob is the guy to be Abraham's heir because he's thoughtful, and he's maybe thoughtful in a not so flattering way, not so ethical way, but he's smart. And Esau might be strong, he might be attractive, and maybe Isaac, who maybe still scarred from the Akedah and is not, in my opinion, terribly much portrayed as a man of action, can have some special pull to Esau because he is such a man of action. But he scorns the birthright, and we, the children of Jacob, reading this story, know that this guy cannot be the leader of the people of Abraham.
So you know that, and as a reader, and I think Rebekah knows that too, because
From the oracle.
Because the oracle, and because she loves Jacob more than she loves Jacob, and Isaac loves Esau, and remark about the blindness. The blindness is going to be a motif that occurs later on in the Parsha. Isaac is blind, and more than once, you've commented that it's not only physical blindness.
Before we get to the blindness, I think the first point I need to make is that I think we tend to sell Esau a little bit short in the same way that we sell Isaac short. I think what motivates Esau is the bracha, not the bechorah. I mean, let's face it, from all we know of Isaac, he's not going to leave all that much. That doesn't necessarily interest Esau. What he wants is his father's blessing, and he is entitled to that. The only time the birthright really becomes important is when he loses a blessing as well.
Yes.
And I think the other thing to remark about Esau is that he is very passionate and he feels in a way that we don't really get Jacob feeling until he runs into Rachel at the well, right? Jacob is conniving here. Esau, when he is able to get this little blessing from his father, bursts into tears.
This is exactly right.
Shattering. It's emotionally shattering.
This is exactly right, Barry. And I would say again, in my opinion, what the Torah is saying is that Esau is not smart enough to be conniving, and we may view him as particularly emotional and raw and honest and guileless. Jacob is all guile, Esau is guileless, and there's something that's, I think, makes him appealing, and maybe makes Jacob feel a little oily. But I think this story is being told that every reader of this story is the child of Yaakov.
So let's go back to Yitzchak for a second and talk about him. There's this moment, the scene now again in with Avimelech, and following the typology of earlier stories where Abraham tries to introduce his wife as his sister. Isaac does the same with Rebekah, and we have an unusual twist here witches, and here, of course, this is R-rated, or maybe not. Let's get into the verse. So he says, she's my sister, and Avimelech, it says in verse 8 of chapter 26, Vayihi ki archulo sham. Stayed there a long time. Yamim, hayamim. The days were going. Vayashkef Avimelech melech Plishtim. Avimelech was looking. The king of the Philistines was looking. Ba'anachalon. He was looking out of his window or into their window. Vayar vehine Yitzchak mitzachek Rivka ishto. And behold, Isaac was playing Scrabble with Rebekah, his wife. Mitzachek. No. Okay.
Well, that's how you know that Scrabble is the oldest board game.
So A, what was he doing looking at the window? B, why was their window open? C, what does the word mitzachek mean? D, I mean, can you give me some characterization of the marriage? And, thinking, you see it as a good marriage, a bad marriage, I've said before, I think that of the marriages of the patriarch, this is probably the best one. I'm willing to revise that based on how we understand this episode and other things. But I'd like you guys to weigh on that. Barry, you want to go ahead?
So the second part of the verse actually informs the first part. He sees Isaac misacheking with his wife. And the one thing Avimelech knows is that what Isaac is doing is not the way you behave with your sister. And that suggests that it's something overtly sexual, but I think the word itself suggests some kind of friendly frolic, that they're enjoying themselves. And this is what sets Avimelech on edge, because I think we're to understand in some way that the incest taboo is practically universal at this point.
But is he bored? Avimelech, is he a voyeur? Is he? We know that Rebekah is a beautiful woman.
I think it's happened. I would say that it's happenstance. He happens to look out at a time when Isaac is doing what he's doing with Rebekah. And there's a fair amount in the Torah that works. It's the same in all literature, right? We're always surprised when something happens in a story, but the author wasn't surprised. The author put it there. So I think it's a detail that drives the story.
And so what do you make of the marriage, or Jeremy, I don't know, anywhere you want to kind of weigh in on this little episode, and in terms of what characterizes its relationship and the being seen like this, or any.
Yeah, I'm going to go. I want to agree with everything Barry just said. I think that detail of they were there a long time. I mean, the Parsha starts off with the story of the fact that they've been married for 20 years before she has the children. So they've been married a long time, and then she's already had the children, and the children have now grown up to sufficient age that they can do the whole negotiations over their financial positions in the family. So they're not there. This is a not, newlywed couple, and they're still taking delight in each other. They're still playing Scrabble, and I think Yitzchak got a 7-letter word on this one, and
with a triple word score.
And I think that I agree with Barry. I think it's happenstance, and that's the significance of the phrase ki archu lo sham yamim. They've been there a long time, and for the first couple of months, they could pull off the sibling thing, but in the end of the day, they can't keep their hands off each other because they're a loving couple, okay. and the sexual or erotic quality of their marriage actually endures well past the point that it's about childhood, having children. It's not about having children. They're just mitzacheking. And with Yitzchak in particular, the fact that Yitzchak's name is laughter and play, that Yitzchak mitzachek, he's being himself.
So is there not perhaps another valence to this word that is more like violent or not the pleasure part of it, but maybe actually there's something.
So what I want to say is that here Isaac comes into his name, right? He gets the name Yitzchak because other people laughed. Other people did the mitzacheking, as it were. but now he's doing it. So he has become Yitzchak, the one who laughs, not just the one who is laughed about.
Yeah, I like that.
All right, so talk about Yitzchak now as a substantial character, and as you know, this is the only parsha where we see him really as a full character, as a kind of landlord, landowner, farmer, shepherd, a man of wealth. Take that away, Jeremy. Go
There
ahead.
you go.
Go, Jeremy.
So he's a force to be reckoned with in this parsha. You know, he's a leading figure in the neighborhood, so to speak. He's a politician, he's an engineer. And I think the one thing that is easy to lose sight of, in this parsha, he's going to receive the divine blessing.
Yeah.
God's going to give him the promise, renew the promise that he made to Abraham, which carries a lot more weight because he is Abraham's progeny. Right? This is really the success of Abraham's covenant, is that Isaac can now receive it.
Jeremy, your reflections on Isaac in the lineup of the matriarchs.
Yeah, well, I'm on the record as thinking that Isaac is a reduced figure, and that mostly he's a transitional figure. The Rebekah is the one with the sharp eyes and the sense, and I find that the story of his blindness, is really significant. In contrast, perhaps, to Moshe, who at the end of the Torah says 120 years, and he's still, lo chata eno, his eyes are still sharp. Isaac is blind. His eyes, tikhena einav merot, his eyes have grown too dark to see. And I think that's not just an ocular description, but I think he doesn't get it. And so he needs the deception. I mean, I would say that the deception that Rebekah and Jacob perpetrate on him comes off as something like a necessary evil. Like if we don't kind of manipulate the old man, something terrible is going to happen.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's kind of what's going on here. And Rebekah certainly sees it, and Yaakov at least plays along. Even again, as Jeremiah though tells us, he exploits and tricks and twists his poor brother, and you just can't feel, especially since Esau is, as Barry said, such a heartfelt character. Havracha achat. Do you have only one blessing? Halo atzalta li bracha. Didn't you hold back any blessings on my behalf? And he cries and screams, and your heart just breaks for the power of Esau as a vulnerable character.
Well, that's how the parsha really ends. It ends with the horrible sense of brokenness, and it's going to be symbolized by the need for Jacob to break through a boundary. He has to leave. He's banished, basically. He's going to be sent out of the household, ostensibly to find a wife, but really to save his life from his brother's anger. The parsha ends with a kind of attempt that Esau makes to reconstitute his relationship with his parents, because he has married Canaanite women, again in line with the idea that he aligns himself with the Canaanites. But when the last line of the parsha, Vayelech Esau el Yishmael, Esau goes to Ishmael, Vayikach et Machlat bat Yishmael ben Avraham achot nebayot. He marries the daughter of Ishmael named Machlat, a relative, and that seems to find, to at least pacify the parents. I think it's a fascinating note to end on, because it says, I want to try something. I think we have a lot of pathos for Esau, and we're left hanging in suspense as to what will happen next week.
So I would just add that this part of the story actually supports Jeremy's reading quite nicely, because one of Isaac's glaring failures, for which, of course, in human fashion he blames others for, is that he did not provide wives for his children.
There you go.
Right?
Yeah.
The longest chapter in Breshit is Rivka being acquired for Isaac by Abraham or Abraham's agent, and Isaac has not performed this filial duty, and it's tragic because you can't really blame Esau for his wife choices. He's in the land of Canaan after all, and I don't think relations with Ishmael were great at the time. Maybe they weren't terrible, but I think he did the best he could under the circumstances. And, like a lot of other people, comes home with the wrong spouse.
He did the best he could under the circumstances, and so did we in this Parsha. we tried our best to discuss this Parsha, and I think we did a good job. And we want to thank everyone for being with us. We're always honored by your presence here and giving us the time and studying with us and discussing this. And you can see that we're left with so many more questions, which we're going to obviously take up next week on the next edition of
But
Parasha Talk.
we should dedicate today's session to a happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Mary Chesler and Carol Chesler.
Carol Chesler.
Carol Chesler had a birthday.
This was in September. The celebration was
Okay, and Barry Chesler had his birthday on Sunday? Monday. Mazel tov.
Thank you very much.
Okay, and we'll see you all next week on the next edition of Parsha Talk. Shabbat
Shabbat shalom.